Hello, traveler. You've arrived at Whispery Sleep Tales, a soft corner of the night where stories float like rain, and your thoughts can finally rest. Here, you'll find gentle tales told in a warm voice, wrapped in the sound of distant rain, made for your softest dreams. Tonight's journey is called The Camera in the Attic. It's a slow, nostalgic story about memory, love, and a dusty old camera that captured more than just photographs. So lie back, my friend. Let the world drift, and let this story keep you company until you find sleep. Shall we begin? It was the last box. Always is, isn't it? The one you leave behind until the very end, because you don't want to know what's inside. Because it's heavier than it looks. Not just weight-wise, soul-wise. The movers had already come and gone. Mom's house, our house, was emptier than I ever thought possible. Even the walls felt quiet, like they were tired of holding in stories. I stood alone in the hallway, barefoot on creaky floorboards, fingers tracing the edge of that last cardboard box like it might bite me. It was taped shut with brittle brown packing tape, the corners soft from time and humidity. Labeled in my mother's small cursive, Attic Misc. Misc. Of course. What a perfect way to bury the things you can't quite name. I sighed, slid the box across the floor, and followed it into the dim stairwell that led to the attic. I hadn't been up there since. God, I don't even know. 12? 13? The light bulbs still work. That old kind, the kind that hums when it's on, like it's alive. I climbed the narrow steps slowly, brushing cobwebs aside with the flap of my sweater. And there it was. Not in the box. Not even tucked away. Just sitting there. A leather bag, square and squat, coated in a thick layer of dust. Almost waiting for me. You know that feeling when something feels staged? Like walking into a dream you didn't realize was yours. I crouched, heart thudding a little too fast, and unzipped it. Inside, an old camera, the kind with weight. Metal and glass and decades of stillness. My fingers remembered it before my mind did. My dad used to carry this everywhere. Not like the way people carry phones now. This was deliberate, purposeful. He'd bring it to the lake, the porch. Once, I remember, he even took it to a funeral. I lifted it gently. The leather strap creaked with age. It was heavier than I remembered. Funny how memories shrink things. There was a click when I turned it over. A rustle, like paper caught in a fan. I opened the back compartment. Inside was a film roll. Unused? Developed? I couldn't tell. I held it up to the light. No markings. No labels. Just this tightly wound mystery. I didn't even think. I just put it in my coat pocket. Like I knew I'd want to see whatever it held. That night, I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about his hands, how carefully he used to load film into that thing. How he'd always say, "Wait for the right light, pumpkin. That's what makes a photo true." He hadn't called me pumpkin after I turned 13. Guess that's when I stopped being easy to photograph. I don't know why he stopped using the camera. One day it was always around, and then it wasn't. Like it left with the season that never came back. The next morning I Googled the nearest film development shop. There was only one in town. A little place run by a man with wire glasses and shaky hands. He looked at the roll, then at me. Old Kodak. Maybe 80s. Could take a few days. I nodded. Left it with him and walked out into the rain. I remember thinking the sky looked like the negatives I used to hold up to the window. All shades of soft gray and maybe. And I don't know why, but I whispered aloud as I walked, "What were you trying to capture, Dad? And why did you never show me?" I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in bed at the old house, my mother's quilt pulled up to my chin. The scent of lavender and dust clinging to the sheets. The camera sat on the nightstand, watching me, almost. It was strange, you know, how something so small could change the temperature of a room. I kept glancing at it like it might shift when I wasn't looking, like the lens would blink, or breathe, or whisper. I had meant to keep packing. There were still drawers full of forgotten receipts, albums with curled edges, and that cabinet full of china no one ever used. But the attic had rearranged my priorities, quietly, completely. The next morning, I made coffee the way she used to. A little cinnamon in the grounds, a touch of salt. It tasted like mornings in 4th grade. Rain boots by the door, her humming in the kitchen. Dad already gone to work. Just steam and comfort and time moving slowly. I took the camera outside to the back porch, where the paint was still peeling in the same places. The light was soft, sky, pale like washed linen, and I held the canister up to the day like it might reveal something. But of course it didn't. Not yet. I knew there was still a shop in town that handled old film. Somehow, despite everything that had changed, the closed hardware store, the new chain pharmacy, Holloway's camera and print was still there, like it had stepped out of time and politely refused to leave. I hadn't been there in years, not since I was 17, and wanted to frame a photo of my dog for graduation. But the bell above the door still chimed the same 3-note melody, and behind the counter stood Mr. Holloway, with more gray in his beard, but the same soft smile. He looked up when I walked in and said, "Well now, that's a face I didn't expect to see again." I smiled back, thinly, the way you do when the past walks right up to you and shakes your hand. I found something, I said, holding up the camera. It was my father's, I think. He leaned over the counter, eyes narrowing with quiet wonder. Well, I'll be, he murmured. That's an Olympus O-1. Solid piece of machinery. People used to swear by these. Then he looked at the canister. You want it developed? I hesitated. Yes, if you still do that kind of thing. He chuckled. We never stopped. Takes a few days, though. We do it slow, the old way. Not for speed, for soul. I nodded. There was something comforting in that, like knowing the moon would rise whether or not anyone was watching, like bread baking or record spinning. Things that take time because they're supposed to. He scribbled a note on a card and handed it to me. Come back Friday. He paused, then added, and if there's anything unusual on that roll, you come talk to me first. All right? I blinked. Unusual? What do you mean? He shrugged, but it was the kind of shrug that carried too much weight to be casual. Just a feeling. Old film. Sometimes it remembers more than it should. That line stuck to me like cobwebs as I walked out. Old film remembers more than it should. It followed me in the car, back through the narrow town streets, past the boarded-up diner, all the way home. And that night, I dreamed of the attic. Only it wasn't the attic anymore. It was a dark room, lit in red, and my father was there. Only younger, his back to me, developing prints that melted as he hung them, one after another, faces blurring into each other. And as I tried to speak, he turned. And his face, it wasn't his face anymore. It was mine. I woke up with a start, sweat cooling on my skin. The camera was still there on the nightstand, still silent, still watching. And Friday felt a long, long way away. Friday came slow, heavy with the kind of air that makes you think maybe it'll rain, but never actually does. I drove to Holloway's with a strange calm, like I was headed not for answers, but towards something that already knew me. The bell over the door jingled, and Mr. Holloway looked up without surprise. He was already reaching under the counter before I said a word, as if he'd known I'd come. He handed me the envelope gently, like it might bruise. Still warm, he said with a wink, and I smiled, thinly. Thanks, I whispered. He didn't ask me to open it there. I think he knew I wouldn't. I waited until I got back to the car, slid into the driver's seat, took a breath, and opened it. The first thing that hit me wasn't the photos. It was the smell. Faint, but sharp. That chemical tang of fixer and stop bath, like vinegar and silver and old secrets. It filled the air inside the car, and suddenly I was 6 years old again. back in the basement, barefoot on cool cement, watching my father through the glow of red light. His hands always steady, always quiet, moving paper through shallow trays like they were sacred. He rarely smiled when he worked down there, but he looked peaceful, contained. He used to let me sit on a wooden stool in the corner. "Stay still," he'd whisper. And I always did. Because somehow, in that hush of running water and chemical scents, it felt like breaking the silence might break something else too. Something fragile, something buried. And then one day, he stopped. Just like that. I remember it vividly. The dark room packed up, the trays emptied and stacked, the red light bulb unscrewed and thrown out. I asked why, and he said nothing. Just ruffled my hair, went upstairs, and never went back down again. Now, holding these photographs, the smell brought it all flooding back. I flipped through them slowly, one by one. A blurry beach, waves mid-crash, a sky too bright for detail. Then a garden, wild and overgrown, poppies bending like they were bowing to something unseen. And then, her. The same woman from the first photo, but younger this time, laughing, her face turned half away from the lens, as though someone had called her name at just the right moment. She wore a wide-brimmed hat, linen blouse, bare feet in tall grass. There was something haunting about her ease. Another photo, and another, always her. Sometimes near the ocean, sometimes on a porch. One in a bookstore, fingers trailing the spines of worn novels. None of them were labeled, no dates, no names. Just her, frozen in light and shadow, and the unmistakable framing that told me my father had taken them. Who was she? Why had he captured her like that, with such care, such devotion? I couldn't stop staring at the one on the garden path. There was a softness to her expression that felt almost familiar, not in a way I could name, but like the echo of a dream, like something I'd once known but forgotten how to feel. And it suddenly hurt, not because I was jealous, but because I could tell my father had once loved someone so completely that it bled into his photographs. I held the pictures in my lap, the chemical smell fading, the light beginning to change outside. And I knew this was no longer just about memory, or grief, or some dusty attic relic. This was a trail, a puzzle, a whisper from the past asking to be heard, and I wasn't about to stop listening. I couldn't sleep that night. The images kept flickering behind my eyelids, her face, always just out of reach, always turned slightly away, like she was looking for something, or someone. I got up before sunrise, made a cup of tea I didn't drink, and sat by the window with the photos spread out like tarot cards. I laid them in order, or at least what felt like order. Beach, garden, bookstore, porch, always her. always alone, and always behind the lens. Him, my father, quiet and deliberate. A man who never spoke of the past, unless it came with a lesson. But these images weren't lessons. They were longing. At noon, I called Clara. She answered mid-sentence, like she'd been expecting me. "You found more?" she asked. "I did," I said, "and it's odd." She came by that afternoon with pastries we didn't eat. We sat on the living room rug like teenagers, knees brushing, photos fanned out between us. Clara picked one up slowly, the one of the woman at the bookstore. She squinted, tilted her head, and then said, "She's beautiful." I nodded. "I think he loved her," I said softly, "before my mother." Clara glanced at me, or maybe during. The thought landed like a cold draft. I shook it off. I wanted to believe he was better than that, but part of me, the part that had grown up listening to silence more than stories, wasn't so sure. "Do you recognize her?" I asked. Clara leaned closer, stared at the picture like it might blink. "No," she said finally. "But—" she hesitated. "There's something ghostly about her." "Ghostly?" "Yeah. Not scary. Just like she was never quite real." She handed the photo back, and I felt a chill, like the room had shifted slightly, or like someone else had just walked in. I flipped the photo over, blank. Of course. No names, no dates, no scribbled hearts, just mystery. "I feel like I've seen her before," Clara said after a moment. "Not in real life, but maybe in a dream." I stared down at the photos again, the way her hair moved in the breeze, the way her eyes caught the sun. Not just a stranger, not just a subject, but something more, someone who had mattered. And yet, she didn't exist in any family story. No albums, no Christmas cards, not even a slip of her name tucked into old letters. That night, I scanned the entire roll, image by image. Some were faded beyond recognition. Some were hauntingly sharp. And always, her. She was everywhere and nowhere, like a ghost in the frame. Finally, I saved them all onto a flash drive, just in case. And then I picked up my phone and texted the only person left who might remember. My mother's sister, Aunt Eleanor. "Can I come by tomorrow?" I typed. "I have some pictures I need to ask you about." I stared at the message for a long time before hitting send. The reply came quickly. "Of course, always." And that night, I dreamed of the woman again. She was standing in the garden, the one from the photo, only this time she turned to look at me and whispered something I couldn't hear. When I woke, my pillow was damp, and I didn't know if it was sweat or tears. I arrived just after 10. The kind of morning where the sun feels sleepy, soft through a veil of clouds, like it hasn't quite decided to shine. Aunt Eleanor lived in a small brick cottage with ivy on one side and wind chimes that sounded like water glasses singing. She opened the door in her robe and slippers, smiling like she knew this visit would come eventually. She always had that gift, knowing things before I did. "Come in, sweetheart," she said. "I've just made coffee." The scent of it hit me like a memory. Dark roast, slightly burnt, exactly how she used to make it when I stayed over as a child, wide-eyed and always eavesdropping on the grown-ups. We sat in the sunroom. The cushions were still the same floral ones from my childhood, faded now, comforting. I placed the small stack of printed photos on the table between us and didn't say anything. She didn't reach for them at first, just sipped her coffee, her eyes on mine, waiting. "There's someone I want to ask you about," I said finally. "My father took these." At that, her expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition with a touch of hesitation. She reached for the top photo, the woman on the beach, the wind in her hair, frozen in a summer that didn't belong to me. Her fingers brushed the edge of the print like she was touching glass, or something more fragile. "Do you know her?" I asked softly. Aunt Eleanor didn't look up right away. She placed the photo down, face up, looked out the window instead. Then, with a sigh that sounded like it had been waiting 20 years to be released, she said, "She reminds me of someone. Someone I haven't thought about in a long, long time." A pause. Then, "Catherine." The name hovered in the air like the scent of old perfume, lingering after its wearer has vanished. I blinked. "Catherine?" It sounded strange in my mouth. Aunt Eleanor gave a small, tight smile. "That was her name. At least I think it was. Your father, he never said much." "Was she a friend?" I asked. The word felt too light, too flimsy, not enough to hold what I saw in those pictures. Eleanor tilted her head. "It was before your mother, I believe. Or maybe not entirely before. It's hard to say." I felt my heart pull in two directions, toward truth and away from it. "Did you ever meet her?" She shook her head slowly. "Number. Only once, in passing. A party, I think. She didn't stay long." I waited for more, but the silence that followed was thick with finality, like a curtain falling. "Do you know what happened to her?" I asked. And Aunt Eleanor, without looking at me, said, "Number. But your father changed after that summer." I swallowed the questions rising in my throat. Ones like, did he love her? Did she leave him? Did he choose someone else? They all felt too loud in that quiet room. Instead, I picked up the photos again, slipped them back into the envelope. "I think I need to go back to the lake house," I said. "The one we used to visit when I was little." Eleanor nodded once, as if she'd expected that too. "You might find more there," she said. "Or you might just find peace." I wasn't sure which I wanted. We sat a while longer, watching the clouds move slow across the sky, drinking coffee that had long gone cold. And when I left, she hugged me tighter than usual and whispered, "Some ghosts just want to be remembered." I didn't mean to fall asleep, but I did. The envelope of photos lay beside me on the couch, the corner slightly bent, as if they'd shifted during the night, eager to be seen again. I must have drifted off sometime after noon, the kind of sleep that comes not from exhaustion, but from something deeper, a quiet surrender. The dream came softly, no noise, just sunlight and a breeze that tasted like salt. She was standing on the edge of a cliff, barefoot, in a white dress that fluttered like a signal or a goodbye. Her face was turned toward the sea, but then she looked back at me and smiled. Not a big smile, not dramatic, just the kind that says you know me, even if you've forgotten. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but my voice didn't follow me into the dream. She raised one hand, not waving, just holding it there, as if pressing her palm against an invisible glass between us. And then she was gone. I woke with my cheek against the warm fabric of the couch, my heart beating too loudly for a nap. The house was still. Outside, a bird chirped once and fell silent. I sat up slowly, running my fingers through my hair, trying to pull myself fully into the moment, but part of me was still back there, on the cliff, with her. The white dress, the smile, the familiarity, it all clung to me like mist. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really. But something about her presence in that dream, it didn't feel like fiction. I pulled out my journal, the one I hadn't used since college, wrote the date at the top, and beneath it, 3 words. She was real. The pen felt heavy in my hand, as if the act of writing it made it truer. I let the ink keep going, pouring out everything. The cliff, the breeze, the white dress, the way she looked at me like she knew my name. It didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a message. The kind you only get once, if you're lucky. As the afternoon leaned toward evening, I found myself staring out the window, watching the light change, remembering, reaching, trying not to be afraid of what I might find. That night, I placed the photo of the woman in the frame beside my bed. No label, no answers, just her face and the hope that she might visit me again. Maybe in another dream, maybe in memory, or maybe in whatever lies between the two. I didn't expect to find anything else. Not really. But I went back to the attic anyway. Maybe I needed the dust, the quiet, the odd, dry warmth of a space forgotten. It's strange what you notice when you're searching without knowing what you're searching for. A chipped teacup, a frayed scarf, a shoebox full of dead pens. But then beneath an old wool blanket I found it. A journal. Small. Leather. The kind you buy with the hope of filling it, and too often don't. This one was full. Every page ink. His handwriting. Tight and slanted. Like he was always thinking faster than the pen could follow. The first page was dated, the 3rd of June, 1984. I blinked at it. That was years before I was born. Back when he was someone I never knew. The entries weren't detailed. Not really, but they whispered, like secrets between the lines. Long drive. She brought coffee this time. Quiet day. Skipped stones. She laughs when I miss. Sunday. The lake. Just us. No clock. C told me about the cliff today. I stopped. Reread that last line. C told me about the cliff today. My breath caught. Cliff. C. The dream. It couldn't be coincidence. Could it? There was no last name. No full description. Just the letter C. But the voice in the journal sounded so alive. Like he had been holding a summer in his hands and didn't know how to let go. Page after page, they spoke of a lake house, sunburns, old songs on the radio, her laugh, always her laugh. It was the only place in all the notebooks I'd ever seen where he wrote with softness, not analysis, not precision, but warmth, almost wonder. Something had happened that summer. Something outside the lines. Outside of me. Outside of what our family ever talked about. I flipped to the very back. One line written hastily as if he didn't want to write it at all. The 25th of August, she said goodbye. No period. Just that. Hanging. Empty. I closed the journal gently, pressed it to my chest. I could hear my heart in my ears. There was a summer, a love, a woman named C, and a goodbye no one ever spoke of again. The attic felt smaller then, heavier, full of all the things I'd never asked. And all the things he never told. But I knew what I had to do. I had to find that lake house, the one with the skipping stones, and the radio, and the ghost of the girl in the white dress. I didn't know what I'd find, but I needed to stand where they once stood, to feel what the journal only hinted at. And maybe, just maybe, find the rest of the story. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay awake, the journal on my nightstand, its cover closed, but its words echoing. Sundays with C. She said goodbye. I kept thinking about the cliff. The way she stood in my dream, white dress, wind in her hair, a smile like she was remembering something too. So I went back to the attic. Again. Maybe I hoped it would offer more if I was quiet enough, or if I believed hard enough that it still had something left to give. The sun was just beginning to rise, its light sliding in slanted beams through the attic window, painting the dust with gold. And then I saw it, a small brass key, tucked into a chipped porcelain teacup, like it had been waiting, like it had wanted to be found. There was a tag tied to the key with old twine, faded and curling at the corners, handwritten in black ink, smudged with age. M.H. Lake. M.H. My heart thudded. Could it mean Maple Hollow? That's what we used to call the old family place. Nestled near the water, surrounded by trees so tall they looked like they'd been there forever. We used to go there when I was little, before Dad got sick, before everything turned quiet. The memories are soft and blurry now, like photos exposed to too much sun. But I remember the sound of the dock creaking under bare feet, the echo of loons across the lake, the way Dad would sit at the edge of the porch at night, staring into the dark like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. We stopped going when I was 10. No explanation. Just stopped. And now, a key to a place I hadn't thought about in years. I held it in my palm. It felt heavy, important, like a door I didn't know I'd closed had just creaked open again. I went downstairs and made tea, Saturday at the kitchen table, the key in front of me, the journal beside it. I ran my fingers over the pages again. The lake, sea, long drives, laughter, and always the sense of something unsaid. I opened my laptop and searched. Maple Hollow was still there, a speck on the map, marked only by an old fishing supply store and a gas station that probably still sold cassette tapes. The lake house, if it was still standing, would be empty now. Ours, but forgotten. Like so many things. I felt something stir deep in me. A mix of longing and fear. And maybe hope. I packed a small bag, tucked the journal inside, and the camera, of course. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I knew I had to go. Back to the water, back to the silence, back to the summer that never belonged to me, but might still be waiting for me all the same. It took 4 hours to get there. Most of the drive was empty highway. Then, narrow roads, winding through forests so thick the trees leaned over the road like they were whispering. I hadn't been this way in years. But something in me knew the turns. The dips in the gravel. The bend where the sign used to be. The closer I got, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed to hush, like they knew I was coming back to something sacred. The GPS died somewhere past the last gas station. Didn't matter. I followed memory instead. And then, there it was. The lake. Still, dark, like ink spilled beneath the sky. I pulled off near the crooked pine, the one my father always parked beside. It was still there leaning, brittle, but alive. No other cars. No people. Just wind in the branches, brushing the silence. The old path to the house had nearly vanished. Grass had grown wild, soft and tall. But my feet found it anyway. Like they remembered. The lake house stood at the edge of the trees, sagging slightly. Its paint peeled down to silver gray. It looked tired. I stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked, low and long, like a sigh. I reached into my coat for the key. Brass. Cool. Still marked MH Lake. It stuck in the lock. I jiggled it. Turned. A soft clunk. Then the door opened. Inside. Dust. So much dust. It hung in the air like snow that never fell. The living room was still here. Sofa slouched. Curtains yellowed. A clock on the wall, forever stuck at 2:17. On the mantel, a photo frame. The picture inside was almost faded to nothing. But I think it was of my parents. Or maybe not. I wandered to the sunroom, past cobwebs and broken blinds. There was a closet I barely remembered. I opened it. Smelled old fabric and dry wood. On the shelf, behind a folded wool blanket, something hard. Something square. I reached in. A photo album. Wrapped in cloudy plastic. Still mostly dry. I sat on the floor, knees bent like I was a child again. Opened the cover. The first photo. A man laughing beside a woman. My father? and her. Catherine. The same woman from the attic pictures. From the beach. From the dream. They were smiling, holding hands on a canoe. Her hair in the wind, his arm around her shoulder. They looked happy. And I wasn't in any of it. Neither was my mother. I kept turning pages. The lake. A picnic. Sunday mornings with sunlight. All moments I never lived. I felt something crack inside me. Not pain. Not jealousy. Something softer. A kind of quiet ache. Why did he hide this? Who was she to him, really? And what happened to her? I didn't know. But I wanted to. I walked outside, camera in hand. Loaded it with fresh film. Stood on the porch. Lifted it to my eye. The lake shimmered below. The wind gentle. The sky breaking open just enough to let the light through. Click. One photo. Just one. But it felt like something sacred. The past never dies. It just waits. Tucked into closets. Behind old keys. Inside silver shutters. And sometimes, if you listen, it speaks again. I drove for hours. The brass key resting in my coat pocket, like a secret no one else could touch. The road curled around hills, lined with trees that had already begun to turn, shedding gold and rust-red leaves. The lake house was just as I remembered. And yet, not at all. The driveway was choked with weeds. Gravel lost beneath a decade of neglect. Shutters hung crooked. Paint peeling from the door, but the bones of it stood strong, like it had been waiting too. The key slid into the lock like it never left. A soft click, and the door creaked open. Dust spiraled in the sunlight, falling like quiet confetti. I stepped inside. The floorboards groaned, a welcomer, a warning. Everything smelled of wood and memory. The fireplace still held charred logs. half burned and long cold. I wandered through the rooms, my footsteps muffled, like I was walking through a dream. Then I found it, tucked behind the old bookshelf in the living room. A photo album, leather-bound, its spine cracked. I sat on the floor, cross-legged, like I used to when I was little. The pages were brittle, photos glued in with yellowing corners. There she was again, the woman from the attic photo, laughing by the lake, sitting on the dock, her feet in the water. Sometimes she was with my father, sometimes alone, never labeled, never explained. There was a page near the end, half torn, showing a blurry image of the two of them, standing close, almost touching. His arm was lifted, like he was about to put it around her, but never quite did. My breath caught, not from jealousy or betrayal, but from the weight of something unnamed, a life before mine that shaped the one I lived, a secret too big to stay hidden forever. I closed the album gently, placed it in my lap, and stared out the dusty window. To the lake I thought I knew. It shimmered, silent and silver, like it had been listening this whole time. I don't know why the memory of that locked box in my father's study came back to me so suddenly. Perhaps it was the quiet of the lake house, the way the wind whispered between the floorboards, or the photograph I just held. That woman again, her smile, frozen in time. Back home. I stood in the hallway outside his old study door. It had always felt off limits, even after he passed, as if some part of him still lingered there. The door creaked open, slowly, like it remembered me. Dust floated through the light, filtering in from the window. And everything smelled like old wood and faded tobacco. The desk was still there, heavy, worn. The kind that belonged to a man who kept secrets in drawers instead of words. My fingers trembled a little as I opened the bottom drawer. And there it was. The box. Just as I remembered. Dark mahogany, with a brass clasp that had always been locked. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the box in my lap. It looked smaller now. Or maybe I had simply grown. I fetched the spare key from the back of the drawer. He never knew I'd found it as a teenager. But I never had the courage to use it. Until now. The lock gave a soft click, like a secret exhaling. And inside, a collection of postcards, fanned out like old feathers, fragile and fading. I picked up the top one, a watercolor image of Florence, the Ponte Vecchio in the background, and on the back, in soft cursive, "You would have loved the way the sun hit the Arno this morning. Thinking of you. See." My breath caught. The handwriting was delicate, personal. The next card was from Barcelona, then Prague, then the English countryside. Each one addressed to my father, none ever sent, no stamps, no dates, just thoughts, floating between the lines. She had written to him wherever she went, as if she still wanted him close, even from far away. I read them all, one by one, a slow ache blooming in my chest. There were no declarations, no drama, just gentle words, a sense of longing, and a peace between the spaces. It felt like she was talking to someone she loved and had forgiven. I kept wondering, did he ever read these? Or did he just carry them? Like a weight he didn't know how to put down? One postcard stood out. A beach in Portugal. A small drawing of a sun in the corner. Her message shorter this time. "Wish you were here. You'd laugh at the way the waves chase my feet. Always see. Always." It hit me then. How many versions of my father I never knew. He had been young once, brave enough to fall in love, gentle enough to keep it sacred, quiet enough never to tell me. I closed the box slowly, like putting a story back between its covers. But it didn't feel like an ending, more like a breath, waiting to become a sentence. And I knew I had to find her, not just for him, but for me, for the child who watched her father disappear into silences. I would use the addresses, the names, the clues hidden in the curves of her letters. I needed to hear her voice. I needed to know the story they never told. The address was barely legible on the back of the postcard. The ink had smudged over time, as though someone had pressed it with a damp thumb. Still, I traced the curves of the handwriting like a map. The message was brief, almost coded. "Sunlight on the bench again today. The lilies are late this year. You would have smiled. No signature. Just a year 1991. I recognized the bench instantly. The church on Waverly Hill. My father used to drive past it without ever stopping, always turning his head the other way. I went on a Monday. It felt like the kind of day that didn't ask too many questions. The church grounds were quiet, wind moving through the grass in long, slow waves. I walked around the side garden, following a path worn thin by decades of footsteps. There it was. The bench. Wooden, cracked in the middle, but still standing. Just as it had been in the photograph. I sat down slowly, as if I might hear echoes, if I was careful enough not to disturb them. "Are you looking for someone?" The voice came from behind. I turned to see an old man in a green cap, sweeping leaves into a pile. His face was leathery with time, eyes the color of twilight. "Not exactly," I replied. "Just memories, I think." He nodded slowly, leaning on his broom. "Lot of memories in this garden. Used to see a couple here every Sunday. Quiet ones. Didn't talk much. Just sat here. Like they were holding a secret between them, but gently." I held out the photograph. Was it them? He squinted at it. That's the woman. And that's him. They were tender. That's the word. Like whatever they'd been through had turned them quiet with each other, not cold. Just respectful. I always thought that was a different kind of love. I stared at the photo again. Catherine in a pale coat, smiling at something just outside the frame. My father's arm around her. Not possessive. Protective. "What happened to them?" I asked. He shrugged. "One day they stopped coming. No announcement. No goodbye. People vanish like that sometimes. Doesn't mean they're gone. Just means their part in this place was done." I sat there long after he returned to his leaves. The sun moved like a warm thought across the stone walkway. I imagined my father whispering something to Catherine. Something he never spoke aloud to anyone else. A love that wasn't chosen for the world, but for the quiet corners of it. I leaned back on the bench and closed my eyes. For a moment, I was sitting beside them. For a moment, I understood. That evening, I sat in the kitchen with the lights dim. The house creaked in familiar places, as if it, too, remembered things it couldn't quite name. I placed the photograph of my father and Catherine on the table. Next to it, my mother's wedding ring. It had been in her jewelry box for years. I'd taken it out earlier, almost without thinking, as if it might weigh in on what I was feeling. It didn't. It just sat there, silent and closed. My mother had never spoken of Catherine, never mentioned anyone before her marriage. Her stories were all about school dances, snowstorms, and burnt casseroles. They were safe, clean, hollow in places. I found myself whispering aloud, not sure who I was talking to. Did you know? Did you pretend not to? My voice sounded small in the kitchen. The kind of voice people use in churches or at graves. I pulled out the old answering machine from the drawer. It hadn't worked in years, but I still kept it. Out of habit or hope. The tape inside was dusty. Rewound too many times. I pressed play. It whirred to life with a faint groan. Beep! Hi, sweetheart. Just checking in. Left the soup on the stove. Don't let it boil. Beep! Call me when you get a chance. The lilacs are blooming. They smell just like you remember. Beep! A pause. A longer one. Then, if you find those photos, don't judge him. It wasn't simple. It never was. But I loved him. Even when he didn't know where to put all his love. Beep! I froze. The tape clicked to a stop. I didn't know when she'd left that message. I didn't remember ever hearing it before. But there it was. My mother's voice, speaking not to the girl I was, but to the woman I'd become. I sat with her words, letting them braid into the silence around me. She hadn't been blind. She hadn't been silent because she didn't know. She had been silent because she'd chosen grace. She had carried the truth like a folded note in her coat pocket, worn smooth by years of choosing to keep walking. And now she had passed it on. Carefully, quietly, through static and magnetic tape. I reached for the photo again, and beside it, I placed her ring. The two sat together on the wood grain, neither louder than the other. Not a war, not a betrayal. Just a life with layers I was only now beginning to understand. The next morning, I awoke with a heaviness in my chest. Not sadness exactly, but something dense and unfinished. The kind of weight that lingers when you know the story hasn't ended. I dressed slowly, choosing my mother's old coat. The one she always wore when we visited the cemetery. It smelled faintly of cedar and rain. At the bottom of the hallway closet, beneath a collapsed cardboard box labeled winter, I found a tan envelope. Yellowed, soft at the corners, and sealed with a delicate piece of tape. My name was written in my father's handwriting. That slow, left-leaning script he used only when he wanted to be careful. I sat on the floor, cold wood against my legs. I opened it. Inside, A single page. A note. If you're reading this, you've already found more than I meant for you to. I don't know how much your mother ever told you. Maybe everything. Maybe nothing. I loved Catherine once. I thought I'd never stop. But life changed. She wanted a freedom I couldn't give, and I wanted a quiet she couldn't bear. Then I met your mother, and the quiet became a home. I kept the photos because memory is slippery. And sometimes love leaves quietly, like smoke through an open window. But I want you to know, BR, what I chose wasn't regret. It was peace. No signature. Just the soft indentation of his name beneath the paper, as if he'd pressed the pen hard, then decided not to sign. I folded the page back into the envelope, but it didn't feel like closure. It felt like a doorway. I knew where I had to go next. The cemetery sat at the edge of town, flanked by pine trees and iron gates that never quite closed. My parents' graves were side by side, the stones modest, weather softened. But there was a third headstone off to the left, one I had passed a dozen times without seeing. Catherine Elaine Mercer, 1961, 1992, still waters run deep. I stood in the chill, the wind tugging gently at my coat sleeves. Someone had left a small seashell on the headstone, pale pink, smoothed by time. I bent down and placed the envelope beside it. Not to bury the past, but to let it rest. The air felt still. Not heavy, not empty. Just still. The phone call with Catherine had lingered in my mind all week. The soft timbre of her voice, the way she spoke of my father like a half-remembered dream. It was clear she had moved on, but there was something in her words that still held a tether to the past. That afternoon, I found myself walking through the town's small bookshop, searching for something I couldn't quite name. The smell of old paper and leather-bound covers wrapped me in a familiar sense of nostalgia. Then, my gaze fell on a shelf tucked in the back, filled with old letters. Some were tied with twine, others stuffed into drawers or stacked haphazardly in boxes. I reached for one, an old yellowed envelope. The handwriting on it was unmistakable. It was my father's. Curious, I opened it carefully, as if the paper itself might hold a secret. Inside, a letter, written on thick, creamy paper. The words, though faded with time, were clear. Catherine, I don't know if I can ever make sense of this. The way you've slipped through my fingers. I think of you in the quietest moments, when the house feels too big and the silence too loud. I think of you, and I wonder what would have happened if we had chosen a different path. There are things I've never said, but it's too late for that now. I hope you know I've never stopped loving you. Yours, Nathan. My heart thudded in my chest. This letter that had never been sent, was a confession. The past suddenly felt so close, as if I were breathing the same air my father had all those years ago. I could almost see him sitting at his desk, penning these words with the sorrow that had never fully left him. I folded the letter back into the envelope, careful not to damage the delicate paper. But there was a pang in my chest that I couldn't ignore. It was as if I had discovered the key to understanding my father, only to find that the lock had already rusted shut. The answers I sought were here, but they were wrapped in layers of grief and unspoken words. I knew I needed to see Catherine again. This wasn't just about my father's past. It was about finding the truth that had remained hidden for so long. The days had passed in a blur, a haze of half-formed thoughts and questions I wasn't sure how to ask. My meeting with Catherine had stirred up a storm of emotions that I wasn't sure I was ready for. She was kind, yes, gentle even, but there was a weight in her words that lingered long after we parted. She had given me a final roll of film, tucked neatly into a small, weathered envelope. "Your father wanted you to have this," she had said softly. Her eyes clouded with a memory she had carried for far too long. Now, sitting in my small apartment, I unfolded the envelope and pulled out the roll of film. The canister was cold to the touch, the metal gleaming in the dim light of my desk lamp. It felt heavy, as though it held more than just images. I knew what I had to do. I took the roll to the film developer in town the very next morning. The shop smelled of chemicals and old paper, just like it always had. The woman behind the counter smiled warmly as she took the roll from me, and I felt an odd sense of finality in her hands. 2 days later, I returned to collect the photographs. The envelope was plain, almost inconspicuous, but I knew the weight it carried. At home, I hesitated before opening it. My fingers trembled as I slid the photos out one by one, each image more beautiful and haunting than the last. And then I saw it, the final photograph. It was a picture of me. I was a child in the photo, no older than 5 or 6. I could see my father holding me in his arms, his eyes gazing down at me with a tenderness I had never witnessed before. But it wasn't just any photograph. The setting was unfamiliar, an overgrown garden, the light filtering through the trees in soft, dappled patterns. It looked like the kind of place I had dreamed about in my childhood. A secret world where everything was possible. What struck me the most was my father's expression. There was a sadness there, but also a peace. It was as if he had made a choice known he would never speak open. That choice had led him to this moment. I turned the photo over. There were no words, no dates, no clues, Just a simple image of a father and daughter. The world shifted around me. I had found the last piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't what I expected. This photograph, this fleeting moment, told a story that words never could. The camera had shown me more than just memories. It had given me a glimpse into a world that had slipped away, a world that existed only in the spaces between breaths and forgotten dreams. That night, I couldn't sleep. The photograph lay beside me on the nightstand, quietly glowing in the dim silver light that spilled through my window. My heart was heavy, full of everything I hadn't said, and everything I never knew I wanted to understand. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I spoke to him, not to a memory. Not to the idea of him, but to my father. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely louder than the wind outside. "Why didn't you tell me about her?" There was, of course, no answer. Only the gentle hum of the world continuing without him. But in the silence, something shifted. I imagined us sitting together again. The way we used to, when I was small in the back porch with 2 mugs of cocoa and a blanket around our shoulders. He would have smiled at me, gently, with that faraway look in his eyes. And I'd ask him again, "Was she your first love?" This time, in my mind, he nodded. Not quickly, but slowly, like it still hurt to say yes. "But then, why did you stop seeing her?" He turned away, his face hidden by the dark. "Because I was afraid," I imagined him saying. Afraid of what it would cost to hold on to something that beautiful. I thought letting go would protect everyone. It was the kind of answer that didn't fix anything. But it was true. "I wish I had known," I said aloud. "I wish you had told me about her, and about that part of you." And in the space between silence and breath, I felt something like forgiveness. Not because everything made sense now, but because I had stopped running from the not knowing. I held the photograph to my chest. "Thank you for loving me," I whispered. "And thank you for loving her." The room was quiet. My eyes closed on their own, and sleep came gently this time, not to erase the pain, but to carry it more kindly. I stood at the counter of the dark room one final time. The familiar smell of developer and fixer surrounded me like an old friend. The red light bathed everything in memory. And in my hand, I held the last unscanned negative. It had no label, no date, just the quiet weight of something long kept hidden. I took a breath, slid it gently into the scanner. My fingers trembled slightly, not from fear anymore, but from anticipation. The image blinked into life on the screen. It was the lake. Summer light poured in from behind the trees. A small wooden dock reached into the water, and standing there, was my father, younger than I'd ever known him, holding hands with a woman in a white dress. Catherine. They weren't posing. They were laughing. Just caught in a moment, completely unaware of the camera. And for the first time, I realized he hadn't taken the photo. Someone else had. Maybe a friend. Maybe even her. They were happy. Not perfectly. Not forever. But in that moment, undeniably, I stared at the photo for a long time. Not as a daughter trying to decode a mystery, but as a woman recognizing love when she saw it. I printed it, framed it, placed it beside a photo of him holding me as a baby. Two parts of the same story. Two truths I now held with equal grace. Later, I walked down to the dock behind the lake house. The water was still. A soft wind passed through the pine trees. I didn't say anything. Didn't need to. I simply sat, breathing in the evening, letting the stories rest where they belonged. Not buried, not forgotten, but finally developed.